All right, welcome. I'm so excited because it is March, and March, as I've already said last week, is Women's History Month. Now, I know you might be rolling your eyes, but listen, stay with me. It is something to be celebrated and excited about. Why? Well, because there are so many fantastic characteristics about women. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about today, though. I'm going to be talking about something that a lot of women probably go through, but don't necessarily are always going to talk about. It's a side of women land ownership, especially that we don't acknowledge a lot of times. Now, I do. But outside of me, how often is this actually talked about? And it's the opportunity, if you want to call it that, or the responsibility, or the timing is probably a better way to say it. The timing where we are thrusted into roles we never really considered. Now, we know that God's plans for us are far greater than we could ever dream up of. And if we lean into his own understanding, he will make our path straight. Proverbs 3:5, right? But let's look at some examples of women that were also thrusted into roles. Because I understand that if you have just inherited land, you are dealing with a lot. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know where to go, how to ask questions. You are dealing with overwhelm and an anxiousness and grief potentially, depending on how you have inherited this responsibility. Most often the time, you are inheriting this role, not of your own accord though, but because someone that you love has passed away. A husband, spouse, a father, mother, grandparent, someone has passed, and you are now thrusted into this role that even if you were kind of aware that you were going to be in the succession plan, we never actually dream up and think about that timing of what is this going to look like. So we're going to settle down some of those fears and we're going to help you feel more welcomed, more normalized for the feelings that you're feeling with, as well as perhaps give you some guidance of some steps you can take if you are currently in this role. So we're going to look towards two of my favorite women in the Bible specifically to give us how did they handle being thrusted into roles? Because a lot of times when we talk about biblical figures, especially, we think that they were just like all excited and ready to embrace it. We really romanticize them taking on these different leadership opportunities. When you actually read, most of the time they were thrusted and put into positions, leadership roles that they never really actually wanted. They never really intentionally pursued. So let's look at how they handled it, where we can also mimic in our own lives and use them as good role models. Now, the first one we're going to be talking about is my favorite woman, of course, the one you hear me quote the most often, and it is sweet, sweet, beautiful Esther. Now, I know you've heard me talk about Esther before because I mention her pretty much all over the page. She's on my homepage, she's on my social media, she's been in some of my other podcasts. We're going to be talking about her again. Why? Because she is such a great example. One, she's a wonderful biblical figure. She has her own book in the Bible, and it's an Old Testament book on top of that. And if that doesn't show you the importance of what Esther was and did with her life, then I don't know what else will. But Esther, when you actually read through it, never actually desired to take on these leadership roles. Esther is very much like you and me. She was going about her normal life. She was happy with how things were potentially. She had her own plans. And then things dramatically change. All right. She's thrown into the queenship role. And then on top of that, things change again. Nothing goes according to plan. You would think that once you're queen, that you'd be like, oh, everything is golden and things are thriving and coming my way, right? I'm going to be on the easy path. But that's not the case. She's placed into this weird crossroads of having to save an entire culture from annihilation, essentially. And there's the infamous Esther 4:14, which I'm going to continue reading on through Esther 17. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read that for you real quick. And I'm actually going to back up and read from Esther 4:11 through 17. And that way you get a little bit of the background of her own mindset. Because again, I think a lot of times when I quote and share Esther 4:14, we think that she is ready to take this challenge, this opportunity to rise to the occasion. But when you read back a couple verses, you actually see she's really hesitant to pursue this journey. So let's listen to what these words say. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in their inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days has passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, who is her uncle here, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. Esther 4:14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. And then if you read a little bit further into Esther 5, verse 1, it says, On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. And essentially, she does exactly what she says she's going to do. But if you paid attention there, he was like, I haven't seen the king in 30 days. He doesn't want to see me. If I go, I'm going to die. And then Mordecai pretty much presents her with that challenge of like, hey, if you don't do this, I'm sure God will save us still. But perhaps you were placed in this role, into this position for this exact reason. Now, this is really hard for us, especially when it comes to our land stewardship and management, and especially if you have just inherited this responsibility. Because how can we possibly think about that positive side that perhaps we have, stayed in contact and stayed in good graces with our parents? Perhaps why have we survivor's guilt, potentially if it's our spouse, outlived them? There is a reason for everything, and I'm not going to be able to explain all these reasons. All I know is that you were placed and handed this responsibility for a reason, just like Esther. We may not understand why. We may not necessarily like the circumstances. Honestly, we most likely don't like the circumstances of why we are handed this responsibility. But the question still remains of how are we going to handle and react and answer this call? Well, Esther pushed back a little bit at first. And I think it would be foolish to think that she was just like, okay, I got this. I will go to the king. As we could clearly see, she was hesitant. She didn't actually want to go. But after Mordecai's encouragement, again, and kind of reminder that, hey, things happen for a reason. God places people in our path. God places us in different positions and timings for a reason. Perhaps this is your reason. So when it comes to your own land ownership and management, I'm asking you the same question. We may not necessarily like how we've come to this position, but let's recognize the importance that God looked at us and was like, we are the right person to handle this responsibility for him. And she spends 3 days. She doesn't just jump the gun and go for it. She spends 3 days prayerfully trying to prepare herself, prays and asks other people to pray for her, which I think is great wisdom and guidance, and something that I myself could definitely take more advantage of, is asking those around me to pray for me to make these right decisions, pray for discernment and wisdom and guidance while I'm trying to tackle this challenge. But then setting that immediate deadline. And this is something I talked about in my very first season 2 podcast at the beginning of the year, is setting that deadline, setting that cutoff. Otherwise, we will always continue to postpone and put on the back burner because it's really easy to do when it's something you don't want to make decisions for because it's overwhelming you. But set that deadline in a relatively short one within reason. It doesn't have to necessarily be 3 days because when it comes to land management, everything takes so long. But let's set something that's tangible that we can actually look at and say and see coming up on our calendar, and let's actually move forward and take action. Yes, we're hesitant. Yes, we have plenty of excuses. But if we can be like Esther, we can accept this role, prayerfully prepare with a short deadline, and then follow through on that action. Now, I have another example in here that I also want to share with you today. And we're going to be jumping over to Luke for this one. And it's a story that I think you're going to be very familiar with, and especially familiar with if you follow me around Christmas time. We're in Luke 1, verse 26 through 38. Okay, so stay with me. I know it's a lot of verses right here. Stay with me for a second. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great, and you will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come over you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her own age, and she who was said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." Then the angel left her. All right, did you catch all that? Mary. Jesus' mother, Mary, is my second example for Women's History Month of some characteristics of being thrusted and thrown into a role that we never actually asked for and intended. Now, let's think about who Mary is for a second. She was pledged to be married to Joseph. She had her whole quote unquote life ahead of her. She had her own plans of how things were going to be. She was relatively content, probably. As a woman that was pledged, she had security, she had safety. Joseph was a good family man, coming from a good family. She had nothing to complain about, essentially. And then God comes, throws in a curveball, and was like, "Hey, you're going to have a baby. You're going to have God's baby. You're actually going to bring in the Messiah." Okay? And how does she respond? Well, one, she of course wonders, like, how's this actually going to work out? She's scared. We acknowledge it says she's greatly troubled at these words. She's scared at this responsibility. And then she accepts it. May your word to me be fulfilled." And the angel left her. She accepted that responsibility. She didn't know how it was going to go about. She was scared. She was nervous. This was not part of her plans at all. But she was handed this responsibility, this opportunity in front of her. And honestly, probably the greatest responsibility anyone could ever ask. I'm not downplaying any of our own land management rules, but in comparison to carrying the Messiah, I mean, that is definitely a different weight. But we can take some great wisdom and guidance from Mary of how she handled this. It's okay to be scared and nervous and not understand how you're going to be handling this. With our own land management, we have our lives thrown about us. We weren't preparing ourselves necessarily to take on this decision-making role. We maybe not knew that this day would eventually come, but that doesn't mean we were prepared today, in today's age, in this week's time frame, this month, this year, prepared to actually accept this responsibility and role. So you may be at a crossroads yourself and saying, how do I react? I'm scared, I'm nervous, I don't know what this is going to look like, how this is going to change potentially all of my plans. I wasn't thinking about being tied down to the land. I wasn't thinking about what decisions and what's going to happen out there. But now you do. Now you do have to make these decisions. And it's okay to be nervous about it. That's what I love about Mary here. And she still accepts the new challenge, the new role, the curveball that is thrown her way, even though she has no idea how she's going to go about all of this, right? She has no idea how she's going to explain things to Joseph now, who was, again, a great family man. How is she going to explain? He's going to think I'm crazy, right? How am I going to explain and handle all of this? What does this mean for my own life? I imagine all these questions are going through her. And we see multiple times while she has Jesus, after she has Jesus, she continuously says she ponders things in her heart. And I love that because instead of kind of doing the whole blame game of woe is me, what does all this look like, or even bragging potentially, she just takes things and ponders them in her heart. She keeps them understanding that things are going to be okay. She may not understand how this is going to work out. And so with our own land management, again, we can follow Mary's suit and ponder things in our own heart. We may not know the whole plan, and that's okay. We may feel scared that we're going to mess it up. And if that's you today, feeling a little nervous that you're going to make the wrong decisions, I have one more section from Mary to make you feel better. One, because it makes me feel better, okay? Not necessarily with land, but with my own parenting skills, okay? And I'm going to read this for you. It's Luke 2, verses 41 through 48. Again, I know it's a little bit of a lot, but just stay with me here. I got to make sure I set the context for you so you understand why I'm bringing this about. Luke 2, starting at 41. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up there to the festival according to custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me? He asked. Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house? But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Okay, so what I wanted to point out here, and I've seen a couple people talk about skits with this, specifically with parenting, when you feel like you're doing something wrong. Mary lost Jesus for 3 days. I mean, quote unquote lost. She didn't really lose him. He was in the temple. He was fine. He was safe. But according to her, she had no idea where he was. She was anxious. She was scared. She thought she lost God's son. Like, what if something happened to him? It was her responsibility to keep up with him, to keep him safe, to help him grow up in the way. And she lost him. She probably looked at that as a big mistake. She probably looked at that as something terrible that had happened. And I'm bringing this out to point out that you may feel that same fear that you have done something, perhaps it's neglected something on the land, and you're like, what have I done? And feeling anxious and overwhelmed that you made this terrible mistake. But I'm here to say Mary made the same mistakes. Maybe not the same with land, but she made a mistake. She lost Jesus for 3 days. And as a mother, I can only imagine the fear and anxiousness that overwhelmed her with all of that. And if Mary can lose Jesus for 3 days and come out the other side okay and alive, you are going to be okay with your land. We will make mistakes. We should accept that we will make mistakes. If nothing else, Mary's demonstration here is that we are still human. We will make mistakes, but that doesn't mean it's the end all. And again, she treasured these things in her heart. Making a mistake doesn't mean it is actually devastating. Romans 8:28 talks about how all things are used for God's purpose and plans. So even our own mistakes are meant to teach us a lesson, perhaps, for the future, to help us or help our children not make that same mistake, or help us learn sometimes the hard way. I know I am personally very stubborn, and I have to learn things the hard way. Our mistakes aren't always the end all. And I think once we can kind of embrace our mind and wrap our mind around these things, it makes trying things and taking action on the land a little less overwhelming. And when it comes to timber sales, I know I always talk about it being a big deal. And it is a big deal. It's a big change, but it's not the end. When it comes to prescribed burning your land, you do need to be careful. It's a big deal. But if you mess up a little section, it's not the end all. Life and time will continue. What matters is that we do take action. The worst thing we could possibly do is do nothing. The worst thing Mary could have done is done nothing when she realized that when Jesus was gone. She realized she messed up. She lost Jesus. She thought he was here. He's not here. He's actually all the way over there. And she doesn't know where all the way over there actually is, just back in town. She went back and found him. She realized she messed up. That's okay. I can guarantee you she probably never lost him in a temple again. We all make mistakes. How we handle these mistakes, how do we handle the lessons from these mistakes? I think will reduce the gravity of them. Now, some are bigger than others, but I would call losing Jesus a pretty big one in my mind. And if Mary's okay at the end of it, she's not chastised, she's not punished, she's okay. She might keep a tight leash around him, but in the end, she's okay. What I do on our land, what you do on your land, taking action, we can reduce the gravity of that weight by just embracing that mistakes will happen. Let's just embrace it and recognize that we do need to move forward. There's so many different examples of women especially being thrown into roles. Now, why am I keep on saying women? One, because it's Women's History Month, but also because women tend not to be as engaged with the land management stereotypically until we have to. And I understand this personally myself because I am the exact same way. We have a lot going on. We're active in our communities. We're active in our church. We're active in our children's lives and keeping up with dinner orders and the household clean. And if you have a career on top of that, we are keeping up all these to-do lists and things. Do we really want to intentionally add one more layer to our responsibilities? Not until we have to. I know I'm that way. But I look towards Esther and I can look towards Mary as a biblical role model for me. That when I'm thrown into these roles, how am I going to look at them? How am I going to embrace it? Maybe I never asked for this responsibility, but now that it's at my feet, what am I going to do? The answer is only yours. Now, there are some questions of, do we sell it? Do we not? And I have a different podcast episode that if you are in that series right now and trying to determine what to do, go check that one out. It's from November. It's in season 1. I think it's episode 33, 34. It's around there. Go check it out. And that'll give you some good parameters and questions to ask yourself if selling the land is a good decision for you and your family. And if you're going to keep it, the follow-up series, part 2 and part 3 from that podcast episode, talks about other considerations to prepare for succession in the future. But you may be at that crossroads right now, and I'm asking you this question. What are you going to do? Will you be like Esther and embrace the role laid at your feet? If you're ready, I have the perfect training for you. Figure out a 3-day video training delivered straight to your inbox, the beginner landowner training. Go to our website, www.landandladies.com, and roll into that. We'll provide you the what's and the whys that you need to be able to answer before you actually start taking action. That will greatly increase your confidence in any decision making with any experience background, any location or timber type or size. Go check that out. Until next time.